You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Our guest this week is author Tom Kawczynski. Some of you may remember Tom Kawczynski from the American Free Press articles that appeared last year when our friend John Friend interviewed Tom Kawczynski, and of course Tom in those articles was talking about being fired as the city manager of Jackman, Maine. He was hired to manage the small city in Maine, a city with a population of only about 1,000 white people, primarily Christian people. And they hired him because he was just like them, because he was a white Christian man. And he fit right into their community, and he did a great job managing it. In fact, he will talk about this during the course of our conversation, how, among other things, the federal government wanted to forcibly settle 40,000 Somalian refugees in this small town of 1,000 white Christian people. That, of course, would have been devastating to that community. And he was able to put a stop to it as the city manager, of course, for having done so. The man who was hired for being a white Christian man was then fired for being a white Christian man. And, of course, the national media converged upon Jackman, Maine, and there was just a brutal crucifixion of his character that resulted in him being terminated from his position as the manager of the city. And he'll talk about that during the interview, and we'll talk about some other things as well. It's just a very interesting conversation. I do need to apologize because I called him on his cell phone, and he is in rural Maine. He is in the middle of nowhere, and I don't know what's going on, if it's bleed over from other cell conversations or what happened, but so if you see, if there are places where it seems like he's dropping out or where it's just jumped, his conversation has jumped rapidly, it's because we had to edit out a very bad part of that connection. And also, toward the end of the broadcast, of course, there's an echo, and we have no idea where it's come from, but every effort that we made to edit the echo out just would garble him to the point that you couldn't hear what he was saying. But you can understand him with the echo. Just bear with us. The content of this conversation is well worth the effort to listen to it. And so without any further ado, here's my recent phone call with Tom Kawczynski. Tom.
Yes.
So where are you living at now?
Living in rural Maine. I've moved to a different town. I'm not going to disclose that, not because I mind so much, but you understand. So
right,
I still live up in northern Maine.
Okay. I didn't know if you ended up in a totally different part of the country or if you were still up there.
Oh, no. At this point, I've paid my price up here. I'm staying.
Okay. I've always wanted to visit up in Maine, maybe go bear hunting or something. And I lived in Alaska briefly, and so I think I have at least a little bit of an idea of what the weather could be like. But I don't know that I would want to live up there in the winter.
Well, it's not too bad here compared to Alaska. It's probably a little warmer and maybe a little wetter, depending on where.
Okay.
But it's not bad. You get used to it. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's in our genetics. We're able to handle this weather. North America generally sits further south than Europe.
Did you see the movie Gods and Generals?
I have.
Joshua Chamberlain said something to the effect of Maine men are of a hardier stock.
Well, absolutely. And the infamy of the 20th Maine lives on down south, I'm sure. But
it does. I'll say Joshua Chamberlain is, I think, one of the few Yankee heroes of that war that I think is respected in the South, as much as he is in the North. Before we talk about how you had gotten fired in Jackman, Maine, tell us, first of all, whether it be your education, whether it be experience in the work world, what was it that qualified you to be the town manager of Jackman, Maine to begin with? What was it that was on your resume that made them, because I'm sure there was a city council and a mayor and other people who had to look and say, this is our guy, this is the qualified guy. What was it that made you that guy?
Sure. I was, the select board chose me from 14 different candidates because I had political experience. I had actually managed several different campaigns. as well as I had run a major department for a contractor. So I had managerial experience as well. And the way the system worked up there was they would hire someone to essentially come in as town manager role. You manage the budgets, you manage the day-to-day executive tasks. There was an extensive interview process. The process took several months, and the council, from what I was given to understand, unanimously chose me to be their new representative, and things were going pretty well up there, at least until they weren't.
So what exactly does the city manager do?
Think of it like a mayor. That's probably close enough to how it works. I mean, I would be responsible for day-to-day operations of the town, of the various employees. We had 7 of them, of the signing of all contracts, and of writing and managing budgets. In addition, when you're in a small town, you have to wear a lot of hats. So one of the things I did was I also served as promoter. I was trying to bring business into town. I would go to a lot of functions and play cheerleader. So there's a lot of different hats you wear when a town is so small, and Jackman's kind of a unique town in the sense that it's basically 60 miles away from anywhere else. It's sort of a stop-off point on the road to Quebec City between there and southern Maine. So very different set of challenges. In fact, I was learning French at the time to be able to correspond better at that. But my job was pretty simple: to make sure that we didn't raise the taxes, that we protected the town from what was, any sort of changes the people didn't want. And I think that actually is part of the root of the story that got me in trouble, because even though I wasn't doing it on town time, I was certainly aware of the larger ramifications of what was happening in society. And I wasn't about to stop paying attention to them, because in my way of thinking, that would be me not doing town, especially when you see how federal money is sometimes used to change local areas.
I've heard a lot of examples of this, different ways. For example, resettling refugees or moving Section 8 housing into a neighborhood that it probably shouldn't be in, different ways that the federal government does things, giving a area school district money to build their school over here instead of over there, stuff like that. But what specifically were they doing to tinker with Jackman, Maine, and why would they even care given its location and the smallness of its population?
Well, I can proudly say while I was there, they didn't do anything, and I'm very glad of that. But that was, part of a deliberate effort. What you see again and again in small towns, and especially a little bit in Maine, is the implementation of Section 8 housing through community block grants. And when there's not enough people to fill it, then they start bringing people in. There's a pretty close connection between a lot of the people who run local government networks and some of these nonprofits, and they see it as a way of solving a problem and working from the ideological perspective of, diversifying this area. And not so much when Governor LePage was in here, but now that we have Governor Murray, what we very well may see is more implementation of bringing in, say, Somalis, where there's already a community 40,000 strong here in Maine, and getting larger all the time. People don't realize this, but they have a birth rate of about 7 kids per couple up here in Maine, compared to the average, native Mainer population having a birth rate of 2. So in a lot of ways, Maine is being set up to be a lot like Minnesota. Now, as I told you, in Jackman, we didn't begin with all hope. After I left, a college ended up receiving a very nice plot of land in the town over. And one of the things I've observed in other towns is that a lot of times community colleges, state colleges, and private colleges are the means through which these sort of changes start to happen. I've certainly seen that up in Aroostook County, which is the northern tip of Maine, and in other places. So I don't want to impugn higher education. However, in Jackman's case, I think at this point, given what they did to me, they're going to take whatever's given to them. And what I hope preserves that town and the many good people and friends who I have there is the reality that it is a very small town of about 1,000 people, and therefore it might escape notice a little while longer in my absence. And that's one of the reasons, in fact, why I took the settlement that was offered to me instead of choosing to fight it out much longer than I could have. Basically out of respect to the people many of whom I like, respect, and admire.
So when you were the city manager, I'm assuming you were living in the town when you were working for the city. You lived there, in other words. You weren't commuting.
That's correct. I lived in the town.
Right, especially since it was 60 miles from anywhere. What was your relationship with the people who lived in the town? I mean, were you well-liked? Were you considered the outsider? What was that relationship there?
Well, I think I was liked. Everyone was friendly. Everyone would wave. I had people over to my house. I was invited over to their house. I hate to say it, but the nature of town managers is they're somewhat treated like mercenaries, where people use them as sort of referees for their own interests. It's an interesting and weird system, but I think everything was amicable. And for my part, I was friendly, and I came up there on a 3-year track, hoping it would become a long-term thing. The feeling that was expressed to me by the board was that it was mutual, and we were doing a lot of important work to save a local hospital, to help with renovations for a school field. I mean, this is not exciting stuff in the big scheme of political conflict, but in the day-to-day life of what you do to make a community more successful, I think it is very good. And yeah, I think I was liked in my town, and I know a lot of people chose to release me. I think I had a lot of friends there, and I still talk to people there.
And, basically you were fired for the expression of political beliefs. Do you think that do you think that you were on the same plane politically as most of the people who lived in the town that you managed? I mean, obviously there were members of the government who disagreed with your opinions, but what about the people who lived there themselves?
Well, the funny thing about the government is I had a select board with 4 members, 2 of whom I know actually agreed with me and didn't have the courage to say it. So that's sort of interesting, but that's politics. People lie in politics. Jackman is a town that's 98% white, about 80% Republican, a rural town. Yeah, most of the things that's kind of north is tact, and I think more than offending people's sense of right and wrong, perhaps that was what offended them more. Although, how I actually got dismissed is interesting, and I'll go into it just a little bit, because what happened was when the hit pieces started getting printed on me, what they would do is they had a series of leftist activists that would go on to Yelp and Facebook and other sources, and they would local shits. And that sort of economic pressure, basically, in a small town like that, just like a lot of small towns, the Chamber of Commerce basically has an outsized role in electing who is on the select board or your city council or whatever it's called. They use that sort of pressure over the course of 72 hours to make it seem as if everyone was against this, and people didn't really have a time to think and reflect on what they were doing. And that pressure, as much as anything, I think is what forced me out. But it's something we've seen done over and to do so well, is they get their people organized, and because they have control over the media, they can create the illusion of a maelstrom of pressure that doesn't really exist. But in a small town that had no understanding of the greater political context, these people just wanted it to go away. So in the course of 4 days, I lost my job. We made a settlement. I walked away. They walked away. And that's kind of how it went. One guy said afterwards, he said, well, I don't have a problem with what he said about, looking out for white people. But he did make a joke about fat chicks, and I didn't like that because I've had a lot of good times with them. So that gives you a feel for how my town looked at it. So, and I would apologize to that man who had a very good time with his lovely lady. So, but other than that, I think it was pretty good. It's the nature of the game. I mean, politics, you lose sometimes, and that Jackman made the decision it did because I think, frankly, the town was at a moment where it needed to make some interesting decisions to not go into a long, slow decline. But they went a different path, and we'll see what happens. I wish the best for the people.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Obviously, you moved away from Jackman. Did it become a hostile place for you to live after you had separated from your position with the city, or you just decided you'd just rather move along or seek another opportunity?
Well, we didn't plan on moving. This is the interesting thing. We lived there for another 8 months after the events, but what ended up happening was the place we were renting, the gentleman who owned it, who we were also on good terms, just got an offer on the house and decided to sell it. So since we had to move anyway, we made the decision to move to another town in rural Maine where we live quietly. It's not too far from Jackman, but we live in a rural area of northern Maine where we can enjoy our lives quietly and just I write my books and I do my activism. So that works out pretty well for myself and my wife, and everyone was friendly in town, and everyone's been friendly in our new location as well. I mean, people understand. There were hurt feelings for like a week or two. There were people asking questions. But by the time I left Jackman, everyone would wave, people would say goodbye, and a new area in our lives, because the reality is, absent that job, the only reason for me to stay in Jackman was just the convenience of it. And my wife having health issues and other things, it made sense for us to move to a slightly different location. So we did that, and, it's a time in my life I value, but it seems the good Lord wanted me to get into bigger fights, and I've been doing since then with hopefully some positive impact. So, and it's a little easier to do that elsewhere than Jackman, so now I've moved along.
As far as being involved in bigger fights, Maine seems like a very remote location to headquarter that attack. But I guess that could also be advantageous as well.
Yeah, no, Maine is wonderful. Coming to Maine is like stepping back into 1962. Helps me think and to focus. But you're right, obviously, that we're not at the heart of the problems. We are increasingly a refuge for people coming from other places, who, whether they realize it or not, are fleeing some of the costs of Marxist government, multiculturalism, you name it, crime, however you want to present it. So that I choose to live up here because of the quality of life and to protect my family. Internet and information makes this a small world. So
right.
I can go ahead and participate in the fights nationally from wherever I live. And you're going to see before this year is done, me take a much larger national profile. I've been putting out books, which have had some success. I have 4 books out now, actually. I just put a new book out 2 days ago, Loyal Revolutionary. That are out there, but I wrote a book about the past, the present, and the future. And my best-selling book, The Coming Civil War, really goes hard and heavy into some of the problems we face nationally. And I try to talk to those issues. And I imagine if things evolve a certain way and we see greater awareness pop amongst people, I might be in politics again one day because people know I stand for something and I'm not going to back down when I believe.
Well, I want to ask you about all 4 of your books, and I want you to talk about them at length. But right before that, I want to ask you one question that's going to sound innocent, but it really is politically charged, and I'm hoping to get a little bit of a small boom out of it. And that is that you said that you live in northern Maine, closer to the Canadian border. Why not just move to Canada?
Well, I don't think they would want me, for one, and I don't. My brand of small government. Canada, I have many friends in Canada, and they live under a regime which is incredibly repressive of certain types of political thinking and ideologies. It's amazing how scared people are out there, and there are very many good people. But as much as the replacement immigration strategies are a problem, and about 10 times the speed, and you'll have a feel for what's happening in Canada, a country that was overwhelmingly homogeneous, and where Chinese have basically taken over Vancouver, Ontario in many places looks like South Asia, and even in Quebec, Montreal has so many people from the Ivory Coast now and from Haiti. It's not the country it used to. Challenges up there, although I will say on a personal level, I always love going up to Canada. Like I said, I speak some French, and I regularly visit Quebec, and there are a lot of good people up there who, I'm very friendly with, and I certainly hope and pray for the best for them. And I think eventually we'll have to talk about some of the issues with what Canada's doing, because they're so changing their country that it may eventually become a security risk to the United States. But that's something probably about 10 years down the road from now.
Well, Quebec is French-speaking, and I would assume that the Haitians who were transplanted there can speak French, and so at least language-wise, they're not a disruption, even if they are in other aspects of culture. But what about the Ivory Coast people? Do they speak French, or are they an even bigger disruption?
No, yeah, the people going to Quebec speak French, and the thing is, Quebec is very weird from an American perspective, because on the one hand, it's sort of left-leaning politically in the sense that it's like Europe, and it has like sort of a pseudo-socialist guild structure. But on the other hand, it also has a very strong sense of cultural self-awareness, which is rooted in its use of the French language. So in a lot of ways, they're much more sensitive and confident in protecting their culture. And what you find in Quebecois politics is Montreal's kind of moving in a more Anglophile, sort of multicultural direction, wwhereas a reform province is moving the other way. And in fact, recently, the Coalition Unir Québec, which is the Coalition for United Quebec, won the election up there, in fact, on a basis of trying to reduce the amount of people being brought in there and to push harder for the integrity of the French language usage up there, which I very much support, and I think it's really been helpful to them. I mean, I read the French language newspapers, and the stuff they print in there is stuff you would not see printed in a
on the point, we think the catalyst
censors would not allow it, and I think that that's healthy for them. So in terms of, bringing in people from other areas, I think generally if you bring in people from third world places, whether it be Latin America, the Caribbean, or Africa, or areas of South and East Asia, I don't think it goes very well. And I think that's a big problem, especially it's a big expense for the Canadian taxpayer. It is for American taxpayers in places like Maine, where we're basically subsidizing Somalis, even if it is indirectly.
What do you think is the motivation for bringing in Haitians? Because, and I say that with a little bit of personal experience, because from 2011 until 2017, I worked for the Florida Baptist Convention. The federal government was actually giving the convention a lot of money to bring Haitians to Florida. Every time I tried to point out that it was costing us more money than the government was giving us to do it, somebody up the food chain for me would just shut me up. But
well, I
never could get it. What is the political motivation, at least in a Baptist context? I wasn't one of them, but there were some people, and it's not that I do not want to see the gospel preached to Haitians. I want to send missionaries to Haiti and let's preach the gospel to them in their own country. In other words, we don't need to bring them to our country to preach the gospel to them. But at least in the Baptist context, there were some people who could cloud it in religious terms. But the government doesn't have that motivation. So what is the government's motivation to take them off of that island and put them into a Quebec or an Orlando? And I didn't expect to go there. So if you're not prepared to answer that question.
And my newest book, Loyal Revolutionary, is that when you look at the numbers, basically, since about 2000, Black voters vote 90% Democrat, Hispanic voters vote about two-thirds Democrat, and Asians vote about 75% Democrat. And most of those people who are coming in are being brought in through immigration, whether it's through refugees that are eventually legalized, whether it's through, brought in through nonprofits, however these sorts of people, refugees who are later repatriated, or, the children they have. And what I've noticed is a tendency to take people from areas that are, suffering third world places that have a lot of problems, admittedly, and they get seeded throughout the U.S. and throughout Canada in places where they can tip the balance. And let me use Maine as an example here, which is a Somali population, which is a little different, but it's relevant. Maine is decidedly a purple state that was trending redward as you saw the national context of where really, a lot of the states that are rural, and Maine is predominantly rural, are trending towards Republican. By dumping 10 or 20,000 Somalis up here, you can potentially shift an entire election and shift a senator, shift a House of Representatives spot. And when you look where immigrants are being seated, okay, you start with California, which has been turned, but the migration is going into Arizona. You see all the people in Texas. You see in Florida where they brought in all the Puerto Ricans after the whole mishap with Hurricane Maria. And now you have, in addition to that, the legalization of felons. So to me, the connecting attribute of all these sort of unintelligible government tasks is in certain areas, it's creating what will eventually, by 2030, be a population stranglehold on the electoral map for the left based upon how minorities vote. And I think it's something people don't talk about nearly enough. The Democratic Party won't say it because they know they're doing it. The Republican Party doesn't want to be called racist. But the reality is this is how people are voting, and the people who control our schools, once again, 90% leftists, are teaching the sort of cultural Marxism that creates politics of envy and resentment, where you're going to have this sort of racial animus be played out in a distinctly anti-white fashion. And I am very afraid that after the 2020 cycle, especially if the left gets control of the government again, with censuses and redistricting, and if they open up another amnesty or immigration, you literally will have no more elections where a conservative can win at the national level. And we've seen already under the Trump administration how far the deep state will go without the sanction of legitimate authority to do certain things. So I wonder, when you wed them back with their natural leftist controllers, what this country might be in for. And in fact, it's one of the main premises of my coming Civil War book, that we're going to see the overreach of federal power be so overwhelming that you're going to see the rural population of the United States chafe and fight hard against that. So unlike the first time around where it was North versus South, this time around it might be city folk trying to impose on country folk. And you can already see how they're saying they're going to use an emergency measure to try to take people's guns. And you and I both know what will happen the day they try to do that with people who live in the country, who own their weaponry and have done so for many generations. So I worry about that a lot, and I think no one's talking about it other than a few voices like us out here in the wilderness.
I heard a pastor in Texas, he recently sent a notification to the sheriff in his county. And he said that should it come to it, he said he will gladly surrender his guns to the deputies or any other agents who come to collect them. He said, but fair warning, I will give them to you bullets first.
Well, that's truly a man after the Lord's own heart. I give him credit for that. You know, there's actually a number of sheriffs now who have been taking the lead in saying that they will not enforce any, gun laws that are unconstitutional. And it's sort of interesting, right? Because if you look at this at a national level, the right is refusing to obey gun laws passed by the left. The left is refusing to obey citizenship laws passed by the right. I mean, I hate to say it, but isn't that kind of what secession sounds like?
You know, it's funny because the whole reason that the southern states seceded was not slavery, but it was, to sum it up in another overused term, states' rights. Or to put it into more legal terms, nullification. But as you look at the arguments, especially for sanctuary cities, all of the sanctuary cities and states are using nullification arguments, the same ones that the southern states use, by the way, to justify their radical actions. California is even talking about seceding now. And Mark Levin, the radio talk show host, is no friend of the Southerners. He definitely takes the Yankee side in the war between the states. But he has done an excellent job of pointing out that the arguments of the left today are the same ones that the Southerners used in 1859, 1860, 1861.
Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt about it. And, a number of us thought and hoped, frankly, Trump would go ahead and act with the same authority Lincoln did with respect to these sanctuary cities, which I think is a very sort of different and frankly, worse form of nullification, because it's not even that they're nullifying, they're going further. Like in California, there are a number of polities where they're allowing illegals the right to vote. And when you couple that with this effort nationally being pushed to eliminate the Electoral College and have a national popular vote, where a number of Democratic states, I think 14 or 15 at last count, had signed up for this, it's an effort to engineer a democratic, through democracy, we are a republic, not a democracy, takeover of this system. And so I think the right will probably have enough courage to not let this happen. And what I think is going to happen if it comes to a fight, which it may or may not, because people may just give up and let it go, but if they do, I think the interesting thing is the big dividing line is frankly not going to be north versus south, but it might be east versus west. And I say that because the West is overwhelmingly urban and never had the small towns settled, probably because of the Homestead Act and a number of things that came later. Theodore Roosevelt, the parks, how much land the federal government owns. Whereas, from the Great Plains east, you have small towns that still remember that. And whether it's up here in Appalachia or up here in Maine, we're in Appalachia as much as someone in Tennessee would be. And the attitudes are not that different. And it might surprise, hearten, and I don't know what you'll make of it, but it's not uncommon to see people fly the stars and bars off the back of their trucks here in northern Maine, because they understand that the centralization of authority in Washington has proceeded to such a pace where it really has tread all over our rights and over, the Bill of Rights. So I don't know what it's going to mean for the long term, but I do think with what they are doing, with the nullification they are enacting, that we are absolutely within our rights to call them on that. And I think as that happens, we're going to see a lot of strange realignments happen very quickly. I think the biggest one, and the one I talk about to some extent, will be when the Republican Party realizes it can't get away from identity politics, and that, the fact that all these groups have basically been radicalized against the white majority means that the Republican Party will have to take a position defensive of the white majority or the white plurality if they wait long enough. And that's going to be a real problem, because unlike being a policy disagreement based on finances, this is going to become a zero-sum game rather quickly. And they might resent people like myself who are talking about this a little bit earlier than they're comfortable. But the reality is we didn't pick this fight. This was a deliberate decision by, the cultural Marxists, the people who came out of LBJ and moving forward, who decided to weaponize race and to basically bring in 1 million people a year and tell them to, blame the majority at the same time that they soaked us of all of our money. And I think with younger generations who aren't as tuned into the guilt complexes of their predecessors and all the sacred cows they had to spend, that, it looks very different to their eyes. So it's going to be a very interesting time politically and a dangerous one. And I think anyone who intends they know how this is going to work out flying, all we can ask is that the good Lord gets us through this safely, and hopefully we have a more just country on the other side of it, where maybe we have some moral leadership that can solve some of these issues that are not easily going to be picked apart.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net.
Extra, read all about it.
There's one question I want to ask you based on something you said a moment ago, and you had talked about how you had hoped that President Trump would be like Abraham Lincoln. One thing that President Trump has failed to do, that I think every president before him has done, even Barack Obama did it, I want to say, some 60 times, and that is to tell federal judges where to get off. Even Barack Obama, some 60 times, was told that he could not do something by a federal court, and Obama basically dared them to stop him. And
Right.
But the history of the Trump administration has been Trump signs executive order, somebody in government, someone on the left, some state's attorney general or somebody sues Trump in federal court, usually in the Ninth Circus.
Yep.
Federal judge issues an injunction, issues a restraining order. Trump does nothing. Or Trump sends lawyers to court to actually fight it in the court. Why doesn't Donald Trump simply become the president rather than just the guy who lives in the White House? Why doesn't he, for example, with the wall? It's a state of emergency. If you're really in a true emergency, you do not have the time or the luxury of waiting for the court system to move slowly. Why doesn't he just start building the wall? He's the commander-in-chief of the military. Why doesn't he just put the Army Corps of Engineers down on the southern border and start moving bricks? And tell the judges that if they don't like it, that they can go suck lemons.
If he listened to you and I, he would be doing that. Unfortunately, he seems to listen to Jared and Ivanka a lot more. And I think that might be the root of the problem. He surrounds himself with all the wrong people. I mean, I've tried thinking about this a lot because I 100% agree with you about, what he should be doing. And you're right. I mean, supposedly he looks up to Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, never would have stood for any of this, Unfortunately, Trump, I don't know. I sort of think he thinks of government like a business, and I think it's a mistake. I think he thinks if he's just going to tell people what to do, they're going to follow it, like they're heads of some department. And he plays all these games with TV and the media where he talks a lot and he says a lot of the right things, but he never seems to get them done, and there's always an excuse and always someone to blame. And I've lost basically my hope and faith in Trump that I had. I'm glad I think that we got him instead of Hillary just because of how awful she was. But realistically, the things he is not accomplishing are running out the clock on our time to do this. And as you rightly said, if it's an emergency and an invasion, which it really is, Trump should be using every weapon he can have. He should not only be building the wall there. If Mexico is our ally and they care about NAFTA, we could put some troops down between the border there and Guatemala and make sure they don't come in if they can't hold them. We could go ahead and tell Mexico if they let these people across that we are going to close the border permanently. But as usual, Trump, just like every other president, puts the interest of certain economic entities above that of the safety and security of the people, and no one has held him to account with the polarization of our politics is so immense that Trump can basically bank on not being a Democrat and get the support of 90% of Republicans, even though he's failing in core constitutional duties, such as the defense of this nation. And whenever you say anything like that, people are unable to escape that sort of mindset. And I think, especially here as he heads towards a second term, that he's gaming us all. He's going to the center, giving lip service to the right, not solving immigration, not really getting us out of the Middle East. He hasn't locked anyone up except, some of his ex-campaign associates. So I agree with you. I'm very disappointed in this administration, and I think that he should tell the Ninth Circuit where to suck it. But he won't. And he's not going to, because he's become a politician, and politicians win by going to the center. And he's going to go ahead and try to win in 2020 at the expense of giving us a president so far left-wing that replaces him that America will not ever recover from it. And it's sad, and it's cynical, and we deserve better.
I'm going to ask one other question, and then we can talk about your books. This is just my opinion, and this wasn't a question I had originally intended to ask you, but I'm curious your opinion of it. My personal opinion, and I've said this before, is that Donald Trump will be the last white man who ever lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Do you think that I'm right about that, or...
I think the odds are not bad that you're right. I think that whoever replaces Trump is someone we absolutely have to have win for our side, and the longer we wait, the harder it will be to accomplish that. That if the person who replaces Trump does not follow and massively expand what he should have been doing, then your prediction will likely be correct.
And I also have a feeling that our first woman president, and I really think that the media and certain powers that be, that the next election, that's going to be whoever the next president after Trump is. So definitely their primary candidate in 2020 would be a minority woman. And of course in 2024, it would definitely be a minority woman. I would not be surprised if both parties run a minority woman in 2024, because I think it's been settled that the next president after Trump is not only going to be a woman, but I think the reason that Hillary will be too old by 2024 anyways, if she's even alive. But Hillary's white, and I think that even that's a liability to the left now. And so
she lost because black voters didn't turn out for her in Michigan and Wisconsin. It's true. I think it's a good analysis. I think that the Republicans would love to put Nikki Haley up there as Trump's successor, which I think would be a sad mistake. But she served a year, she kept her mouth shut, and she'll be able to pretend, and the party will rally behind her, and they'll pay lip service to the idea. And, if someone like Kamala Harris doesn't work, I know the Democrats, when they decide things aren't going very well about midsummer, are going to beg Michelle Obama to come back. And as terrible as she is, the media machine behind her will be immense supportive. And frankly, I don't even think Trump could stop that if it happens that way. And that is what I fear will happen, but we will see. But I think this idea, I mean, the Republicans always imagine that they're going to somehow change the voting habits of other groups. It doesn't really work because the whole leftist ideology is give the minorities everything everyone else has. And it's just too effective because they control the education system. Maybe if they didn't, but it's not going to change in time. And therefore, I think your predictions, as harsh as they are, they largely reflect similar thinking that I have. And that's why, hopefully we can do something sooner than that. And, in a few months, I'm thinking I might try to articulate a better alternative. I'm working on a book on it right now, beyond the one I've written, because frankly, the Republican Party we have now is not only not aware of the problem, but they're actually making it worse. And I'm very concerned about that, as I'm sure you are also.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. Recently interviewed Billy Roper, and he's read your book, The Coming Civil War. And he's of the opinion that Civil War is going to happen somewhere between 2020 and 2024, so that there will not be a 2024 election.
Let me give a super short version of what The Coming Civil War says, because it's not time to get misinterpreted. Basically, I think that there are a number of irreconcilable divisions in America that represent fault lines. Any one of these fault lines going could set up every other one. And the big four that I identify are the left versus right, the whites versus everybody else, the country versus the city, and the traditional Christian versus sort of your progressive Muslim types. And you could separate out the religiosity of it and the sociology of it. But the short version is people are fighting on different terms. If the right picks the battle, it will probably be over a cultural issue, maybe forced abortion, maybe gun grab, something like that, maybe the country being imposed upon. If the left picks the battle, they'll probably pick it as a race war against, based on how hard they push the anti-white narrative. But the funny thing is, when you look at what people's interests are and how they line up, there are basically two groups, which is that you end up with white country, traditional folk who lean right versus diverse, urban, city folk who lean left. And you can sort of draw the line on your map and sort of a county by county level where it's not going to be north versus south or east versus west as clearly as that, but it's literally going to be the country versus the city with the suburbs in between. And the war, if it happens, will come to that. Now, when I say there's going to be a civil war, it might be a cultural war. It might become a hot war. I don't know. I kind of hope not, because I know how many tens of millions of people will die if it comes to that. All that being said, the book says that these conflicts we have are irreconcilable under the current political system, where both sides are basically trying to use the federal government to impose their values on the other, and whether that ends up being what we talk about with sanctuary cities of the left, nullifying what the federal government's doing, or the sheriffs, say, in Oklahoma, who are nullifying the idea that the Second Amendment be abrogated. The reality is, when the emperor has no clothes in D.C., what you're going to see is some sort of struggle either for stronger centralized leadership, which could go either left or right, or some sort of dissemination at the local levels where, you could see states start to break away, especially if there was a crisis. In a true crisis, I'm not confident at all of this country's ability to pull itself together. And so that was sort of the backdrop to the coming Civil War. Now, in terms of the timing and speed of it, I think that if we're going to see a hot conflict break out, it will probably do so no later than, let's say, 2032. The longer it takes to happen, the less likely it is to happen. And the book predicts 6 different scenarios. The 3 most common ones are what I call submission, which is basically things continue along the sort of leftist multicultural path. And at this point, I'd say there's about a 50% chance of that happening. There's about maybe a 15% chance of seeing some sort of a nationalist movement on the right take over the Republican Party and actually do something about our immigration system and reset the law, something closer to what the founders intended. But that's going to take strong leadership that Trump had the opportunity to exercise, but as you clearly stated, has not done. Or there's like a 30% chance that there's some sort of a collapse that happens basically because people make some wrong calculations. And we could see in a lot of ways America dissolve sort of like the old Roman Empire did in constituent states that would be different regions, like the Old South would be one, New England might be one. And I think that's one of the unique things about America, and I didn't understand this until I started doing a lot of interviews with some of the Europeans, but America has oddly always been an empire. We were never a single ethnic state where they had that strong bond of cultural unity that held us together. As you can well attest, having a distinctive Southron culture that's very different than New England or the Mid-Atlantic where I lived for many years. And because of that, in the absence of a strong centralizing authority, the tendency is for our constituent nations within these United States to kind of spin themselves off. And I think that if we don't recover that soon, that's what will happen. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing depends a lot on where you live and how things shake out. But the one thing it will be is certainly tumultuous and, hard to predict how it will exactly play out. But I know why Billy takes the perspective he does. And to be honest with you, it's not an unrealistic prediction he makes if it is a surprising one to many people, although probably not people who listen to your show.
One thing that I have told our audience before is that in the Bible, the word nation in the Bible can simply be translated as a people. Mm-hmm. We think of a nation, we think of a political construct that operates within a defined set of borders. But that is not a nation, that is a state. And so the nation and the state are two separate things. Sometimes you have a nation and the state in the same place, like, for example, France or Germany, although with immigration and things, that is breaking down. We talk about the ethno-state or whatever. That is a place where you have the nation and the state both functioning the same. And maybe you say it never happened, and maybe it didn't. Maybe it did. If the United States ever did have a nation and a state at the same time, it would have been right after the Revolution, where you had primarily a bunch of Englishmen who decided to shake off the bounds of what they considered to be a tyrannical state and form a new one. But as you've said, with immigration and other factors that have taken place over the last 200 and some years, if there ever was an American nation, it's long ago broken down. I believe one of the reasons that the South ultimately seceded was you had a nation in the South, even if they only had a state for 4 years, that being 1861 to 1865. But you had a nation in the South, even and you still have a nation. You still have a nation in the South, though again, immigration is breaking it down and so forth. Basically, what you're describing, if I'm interpreting it right, is that right now you have several nations that are being forced to sit under one state, which you rightly described that as an empire. And basically what's going to happen is we're going to dissolve into what should naturally be our nations.
I think that is a very possible outcome. I think that's a possible outcome. I think the creation of a new empire, I mean, it could be something where the U.S. is reforged on a more decentralized understanding on a nationalist basis that allows more autonomy for regional individual expression. I think that's the optimistic outcome. I think a pessimistic and frankly the most likely outcome is that the U.S. evolves into something more like the USSR, where you see certain areas, because of their population and their willingness to oppose force, that being probably California and parts of the Northeast corridor, impose their values on areas that are increasingly restive, like the South would be, or Appalachia, or areas in the upper Midwest or the Mountain West. So I think that's entirely possible. I don't know which way it's going to go, but I 100% agree, and I think it's a very good explanation of what I'm saying, that in fact we are multiple nations within a single empire. And so we need to either, one of the optimistic outcomes I tried to imagine is if you could break up into the constituent parts, but the reality is different sides involved are so mistrustful and hateful of one another, I see no way that happens absent physical kinetic conflict. And if it comes to a point where there's a fight like that, it's likely there will be, the borders will either be where those fights are won and lost, or alternatively, if there is an ultimate victor, they will impose a new empire on their basis on them, which will be either reactionary or probably communist in nature, which is where we're going. It's sort of a repeat of what happened to Germany in the 30s, what had happened to Russia and some of the other nations in Europe. I don't know how it plays out. I really don't. But I do think people need to be thinking of these problems, because now is a very good time for people to get themselves to a place where they think they might belong. And, that's why I live in northern New England, why I worked so hard when this first started to connect the people of New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont, because we do have a separate culture up here. I think it's very viable, that I enjoy very much. And, we make strange allies and strange bedfellows. That's why Billy and I became friends. And we talk about these issues, and every area will have to deal with their own things. But for the moment, we're still in this national context, which is the disturbing part is neither party honestly is talking about any of this. And this is the root of what people are concerned about. I know because so many people ask me, and I know they ask you as well, and they're worried about what's happening at this level. And the fact is that government, as you rightly say, a nation is its people. And we have this illusion that, the Constitution, as well designed as it was in many ways, and the Bill of Rights, will magically protect us from the importation of millions of people who don't share our values or our culture. And there is absolutely no historical precedent for that being true. In fact, historical records such as exist in these cases suggest that decadent empires that give way to, more virile populations from elsewhere are usually quickly replaced within several generations. And we're already 3 generations into the process. So it's a time for people to wake up and to be really aware. It's a time for people to pray, hopefully for guidance, and that we come through this, better, whatever that looks like on the flip side, than what they're doing now, because we have federal government that doesn't know or care about this problem, and opposition that's using it to their advantage, and not many people speaking up for the interests of the people, whether they be for, local people living in their regions, or even at the national level for the native population, whether it be a Yankee or a Southerner, because we're just as neglected in the same way, and it's frustrating. But people are starting to understand it, and the conversation we had today is a big step toward the awareness people need to have, and we're going to keep having these as badly as they try to shut us down, which is the biggest challenge we face, where we can't have an honest conversation about what's happening. And I think that as you see the people on the left do that, that kind of gives proof that they know exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it. And they're counting on our weakness to facilitate that. And I hope no one, whatever decisions people make for themselves, that they don't just simply give in, but rather that they hand the bullets, or they hand the guns in with the bullets pointed first. You know what I'm saying?
So was The Coming Civil War, that was your first book, correct?
It was my second. My first book was Someone Has to Say It, The Hidden History of How America Was Lost. And it basically talked about 100 years of Marxist takeover of institutions in the United States. So,
and then your 2 books after that, were they continuations of The Coming Civil War, or are they totally separate?
They're a little different. After Trump was a challenge that was given to me about how to imagine a peaceful way to lead nationalism towards success. And I tried to think about how nations were created, how peoples came out of different tribes. Like the Germans, for instance, who were once Angles and Saxons and Bavarians and all the various, entities that make up Germany. And what you need to create a nation is you need strong laws to beget a culture that unites people, and eventually people who are united through genuine ties of blood. And America was well on its way to becoming an ethnicity, I think, until about 1950 or 60 when, you saw Hart-Celler enacted and all these people brought in here. And so in a lot of ways, America's back at the start where we either have to be an empire or we are going to have to split. And so the book really talks about the process of nation building, and then it goes into a lot of policies about how to change demography, about who's having kids, but both the flip sides of it, both why we shouldn't bring in people in from outside, but more importantly, how we increase birth rates here at home, and that we need to reroute our political system in understanding the family as the core unit of society rather than the individual. Now, Loyal Revolutionary, which is my last book that I just put out, is a different book. It's more philosophical. It's more a mindset to how one approaches the struggle, but it puts, for people, especially for white people, who don't know how to make the moral case for their own survival, for what they want to preserve in this country, I did my very best over 224 pages to make the case so you don't have to. So that when someone comes to say, oh, you have to give this away or you have to do that, understand that there is no more moral cause than fighting for the welfare of your people. I mean, even the gospel talks about it, right? Christ was saying, a man has no greater love than the love of his fellow man, and of course, that's in a larger Christian sense, but it's also in the sense that you have to be willing to fight for your people. And in this country, the majority has never been asked if we wanted what was being done to us. We never asked if we wanted our replacement. We were never given a choice about the things that have been done to us. And because of that, I think we have the right to demand that someone stands up for us. And God willing, we'll find that. If not from the Republican Party, then from what will surely replace it. And then we'll see what happens. And that's kind of where my writing has gone for the last little stretch. So hopefully that is something that will be helpful to people. And some people always tell me with my writing that I am the author they like to give to their spouse who doesn't believe them, because I try to be a reasonable guy. So I don't know if that's a good niche or not. It has to be the air supply of the alt-right, but I certainly try to make the case as rationally and reasonably as I know how.
So how do our readers get a hold of your books?
For the moment, they're still available on Amazon. If you want to go on there.
You don't say that optimistically. You have a feeling they could come down any day now.
I have tried very hard to put things in a way that connects in a broader audience so that doesn't happen. But you're right. At some point, we'll get banned just because anyone who's right of center can get banned. If that fails, and also, of course, for people who don't want to participate in that, which I don't blame you for, you can contact me at Tom at National Right or look at nationalright.us. There's information there on how to reach me, and all the books except I got to put the last one that I just put up there, but I will have copies as of the middle of this month for people who want signed copies, and anyone who wants to reach out. I'm extremely approachable, so if you have any questions, I'm happy to share information. Look up the reviews and all the stuff on Amazon. All my books are very highly rated. Let me know what you want. The prices are the same, except you have $5 shipping, and I'll do deals for people who want multiple copies, and I also have digital copies for people who prefer PDF or whatnot that are available for $10 a piece for each of those books. So, but I just wanted to say thank you for letting me do that. And also, if people use Gab, at Tom Kawczynski, KAWCZYNSKI is a good place to find me. And you'll be hearing more from me in the future. Just right now, I'm in the process of thinking and working through some things, which is something that's really important. After I got fired, I really had to think about what went wrong in life. And, I realized it wasn't what I supported was wrong, but there's a much bigger problem, and all of us who have the opportunity to be activists who are out there really need to think about how we're going to reach more people, and that's what I work on. So, Lord willing, we'll figure it out, and we'll come through a stronger country and more prosperous one with more respect for each of our regions, and And I know whatever happened, the Southerners were going to have a very large role to play in it. I mean, I think before it's all said and done, Yankees like myself might be depending on people like you guys down there, and hopefully we can help one another as this all goes forward, whatever future comes for all of us.
And that is all the time that we have for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. I want to apologize once again for the echo in the last half of that telephone conversation with our guest, Tom Kawczynski. And I appreciate your enduring it and still being with us to the very end. Of course, Tom had a lot of very interesting and thought-provoking things to say, and I know I'm going to be chewing on this for the better part of a week, as I'm sure you will also. But once again, next week we'll be back and we'll have another guest and another great show for you. Until then, from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, God bless. See you next week.